USS Michigan, or BB-27, was America's first dreadnought. And you're probably saying, no, history in the dark, darkness the curse. You're wrong. And I'm gonna type a mean comment to you about this, because this is a South Carolina class, and therefore her sister, South Carolina, was the first dreadnought battleship for the United States. And if we go by numbers, BB-26 South Carolina would indeed be considered the first. But there's a problem here. See, Michigan was laid down 1 day before South Carolina. She was launched a month and a half before South Carolina, and she was commissioned almost 2 months before South Carolina. So while she has a later number, and the class is named for her sister, Michigan's the older one. So technically speaking, USS Michigan was the first dreadnought of the United States. She was 452 feet 9 inches long overall. She had a beam of 80 feet 3 inches and a draft of 24 feet 6 inches. She would displace 16,257 tons as designed, and up to 17,900 tons at full load. She'd be powered by 2-shaft vertical triple expansion engines that were rated for 16,500 horsepower, and fueled by 12 coal-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers, pushing her to a top speed of 21 miles per hour, 18.5 knots. She had a cruising range of 5,000 nautical miles, at a speed of 10 knots, and she had a crew of 869 officers and enlisted men. Her armament consisted of a main battery of 8 12-inch Mark V guns, in 4 twin-gun turrets on her center line, which were each placed in 2 super-firing pairs both forward and aft. Her secondary battery consisted of 22 3-inch guns mounted in casemates along the side of her hull, and she had a pair of 21-inch torpedo tubes submerged in her hull on each broadside. Her main armor belt was 12 inches thick over her magazines, 10 inches thick over the machinery spaces, and 8 inches thick everywhere else. Her armored deck was between 1.5 to 2.5 inches thick. The gun turrets had 12-inch thick faces, and their supporting barbettes had 10-inch thick armor plating. 10-inch thick armor also protected the casemate guns, and her conning tower had 12-inch thick sides. Michigan would be laid down on December 17, 1906, at the New York Shipbuilding Corporation. She was launched May 26, 1908, and fitting out was completed by January 4, 1910, and she was commissioned into the United States Navy. She was assigned to the Atlantic Fleet and began a shakedown cruise to the Caribbean, which lasted until June 7th. She joined training maneuvers off of New England beginning on January 29th, and a training cruise over to Europe soon followed. She left Boston, Massachusetts on November 2nd, stopping over in Portland in the United Kingdom, as well as Cherbourg, France, arriving there December 8th, and actually remained there until the 30th, when she left for the Caribbean again. She reached Guantanamo Bay in Cuba on January 10th, 1911, and continued on to Norfolk, Virginia. And an interesting fact should be made about Michigan. One of the members of her crew was a man named John Henry Towers, who was notable as a naval aviation pioneer. He served on Michigan as a spotter for the main guns, and the long range of those guns, which had enough power to shoot farther than the actual horizon, convinced him that spotter aircraft should start being used. She then cruised the East Coast for most of the following 2 years. On November 15th, 1912, she would head off for a much longer cruise into the Gulf of Mexico. She then headed south to Veracruz, where she arrived on December 12th, and remained there for 2 days before beginning her voyage home, reaching Hampton Roads on December 20th. She patrolled the East Coast again for the first half of 1913. On July 6th, she would steam out of Quincy, Massachusetts, for yet another voyage down to Mexican waters. And this particular voyage had been the results of the Mexican Civil War, which threatened American interests in the country. She arrived off of Tampico on July 15th, and thereafter cruised off the Mexican coast until the 13th of January 1914, where she headed back to New York City, Then she transferred to Norfolk. On February 14th, she would leave port for a short voyage back to Guadalcanal Bay in Cuba, though was back in Hampton Roads by March 19th. She had a third cruise to Mexico on April 16th to help support the United States occupation of Veracruz. She reached there on April 22nd and landed a battalion of Marines as part of the occupation force. She then patrolled the coast before heading back to the U.S. on June 20th. She would reach the Delaware Capes 6 days after that. For the next 3 years, she settled into more peacetime cruises, just kind of floating about, vibing, hanging, not really doing a whole heck of a lot. Though in December of 1914, her crew would start experimenting with newer fire control directors to aid in gun laying. Those directors produced really good results in gunnery tests conducted in early 1915. In September of 1916, she conducted gunnery practice with the old Monitor, Guantanamo, serving as a target. On September 21st, during another round of this, the shell in Michigan's left gun on the forward super-firing turret decided to explode. And I mean explode before actually leaving the gun. The gun would be severed, and fragments from the shell would damage the forecastle deck and the superstructure. One man was injured by a piece of debris, but fortunately this didn't result in any deaths, and she would have to return to the Philadelphia Navy Yard for repairs. On April 6, 1917, the United States would finally declare war on Germany and enter World War I. But, due to her slower speed than newer dreadnoughts, Michigan would be assigned to Battleship Force 2, and was tasked with training naval recruits, as well as escorting convoys. As part of the training missions, she would participate in fleet maneuvers and gunnery exercises. On January 15th, 1918, she was cruising off of Cape Hatteras on a training exercise when a heavy gale and rough seas managed to knock over her forward cage mast. She'd rolled really badly to port before rolling sharply back to starboard, causing the cage mast to give way, snapping at its narrowest point, which interestingly had been damaged in the explosion I mentioned earlier. It was repaired, but only barely. It was just patched over, so it was a weak spot. This accident managed to kill 6 men and injured another 13. She was forced to steam back to Norfolk, transferring the injured to the hospital ship Solace, and then went to the Philadelphia Navy Yard for further repairs, arriving there on January 22nd. By early April, she was fixed though, back in service, and for the next several months she trained gunners in the Chesapeake Bay, while on another escort that had left the United States on September 30th, her port screw fell off. Just fell off. It happens. As a result of this, she was forced to leave the convoy on October 8th and returned to port for repairs again. She remained out of service for the rest of the war. In November of 1918, Germany would sign the armistice and end World War I. Michigan was then assigned to the Cruiser and Transport Force in late December of 1918 to ferry American soldiers back from Europe. She made 2 round trips in 1919 for this, and between them, she would personally ferry back 1,062 men home to America. In May, Michigan would be sent to Philadelphia for an overhaul that lasted through June, and then returned to her peacetime training routine. On August 6, she would be reduced, though, to limited commission, and stationed at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. Dreadnought technology had advanced quite a bit over the last decade and throughout World War I. The first dreadnoughts of America, the South Carolinas, were starting to be seen as very outdated compared to many of their more modern cousins, so Michigan and her sister did not have much time left. But they still kept them around for at least a little bit longer. On May 19, 1920, she steamed to Annapolis to pick up a contingent of midshipmen for a major training cruise. After departing Annapolis, she headed south and transited the Panama Canal before heading to Honolulu, Hawaii, arriving there on July 3rd. She visited several naval bases on the west coast of the United States throughout the summer, before she returned to Annapolis on September 2nd. 3 days later, she'd be back in Philadelphia, where she was decommissioned. But interestingly, she didn't stay that way. In 1921, she was actually reactivated for another cruise down to the Caribbean, departing on April 4th. She would return to Philadelphia on April 23rd, but then, interestingly, she would wind up embroiled in a scandal? What? Her commanding officer at the time, Clark Daniel Stearns, instituted a series of sailors' committees on May 3rd to ease tensions between officers and the crew. The commanders of the Atlantic Fleet and Michigan Squadron decided that these committees were actually a threat to discipline and evidence of Marxist influences. What? I'm sorry, this... Basically, what was happening is that Stearns was having his men form unions to try to make things work better, but the Navy did not like that at all. Edwin Denby, who was then the Secretary of the Navy, was contacted, and Stearns was relieved of command, after her commanding officer was removed for being a filthy communist. On May 28th, Michigan would pick up another group of midshipmen for yet another training cruise. This voyage took her back to Europe, with stops at multiple ports. She'd be back in Hampton Roads by August 22nd. By this point, discussions between Britain, America, and Japan in order to limit the amount of warships was being considered. The nations at the time didn't want to start a naval arms race, so wound up convening the Washington Naval Conference to discuss limitations, which would produce the Washington Naval Treaty, signed by each nation in February of 1922. Under the terms of Article 2 of the treaty, both Michigan and her sister South Carolina were to be scrapped. As the oldest dreadnoughts, they were considered obsolete anyway. Michigan, America's first dreadnought, would put to sea for the last time on August 31st. She was bound for the Breakers Yard in Philadelphia. She went there under her own power. She arrived there on September 1st. She'd be stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on November 10th, 1923, and broken up for scrap just the next year. It's a sad end for America's first dreadnought, and though her career was relatively short, it was actually a lot more interesting than one would think. She served faithfully, and should never be forgotten. USS Arkansas, or BB-33, was a dreadnought battleship, and, technically the second member of the Wyoming class, but that's wrong. Even though the class is named after her sister Wyoming, once again, these birth dates are, well, actually quite simple no matter how you slice it. Arkansas is the older sister in this case. She was laid down first, launched first, and commissioned first, except the class is named after her little sister. So, but in any event, these were still rather early dreadnought-style battleships. Arkansas, in particular, was 562 feet long, with a beam of 93 feet 3 inches and a draft of 28 feet 6 inches. She would displace 26,417 tons as designed, and up to 27,680 tons at full load. She was powered by 4-shaft Parsons steam turbines, and 12 coal-fired Babcock and Wilcox water tube boilers that were rated for 28,000 shaft horsepower, pushing her to a top speed of 20.5 knots. Her cruising range was 8,000 nautical miles at a speed of 10 knots. She was armed with a main battery of 12 12-inch Mark 7 guns in 6 twin Mark 9 gun turrets on the centerline, 2 of which were placed in a super-firing pair. The other 4 were placed aft of the superstructure in 2 super-firing pairs. Her secondary battery consisted of 21 5-inch guns mounted in casemates along the side of her hull. Her main armor belt was 11 inches thick, while the gun turrets had 12-inch thick faces. Her conning tower had 11.5-inch thick sides. Arkansas was laid down on January 25, 1910 at New York Shipbuilding in Camden, New Jersey. She'd be launched January 14, 1911, and she was commissioned on September 17th of 1912 at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, under the command of Captain Roy C. Smith. She participated in a fleet review on October 14, 1912 for President William Howard Taft. She would actually take Taft aboard that same day for a trip down to Panama to inspect the Panama Canal, which was still under construction at the time. After delivering Taft to the canal zone, she began her shakedown cruise, and during that time, the Navy's first long-distance continuous wave wireless telegraphy system was successfully tested, with regular transmissions received by Arkansas from a prototype Pulson Arc transmission facility that was located in Arlington, Virginia. This was a big deal at the time, and would push Navy communication systems into a much more modern age. On December 26, she'd return to the Canal Zone to pick up Taft again and take him to Key West, Florida. She was then assigned to the Atlantic Fleet and participated in fleet maneuvers off the east coast of the United States. Her first overseas cruise was to the Mediterranean, which she set out on in late October of 1913. She'd stop in several ports during this trip, including Naples, Italy, on November 11th, where she would actually celebrate the birthday of King Victor Emmanuel III of Italy. In early 1914, an international incident with Mexico would culminate in the American occupation of Veracruz. Arkansas did participate in this occupation and contribute 4 companies of naval infantry, which amounted to 17 officers and 313 enlisted men. American forces had to fight their way through the city until they secured it, and 2 of Arkansas's crewmen were actually killed during this. Another 2, John Grady and Jonas H. Ingram, would be rewarded the Medal of Honor during the occupation. Her detachment would return on April 30th, and she'd remain in Mexican waters until September 30th when she left to return to the U.S. She arrived in Hampton Roads, Virginia on October 7th to take part in some naval exercises. She then headed for the New York Navy Yard for some maintenance. After repairs, she steamed back down to the Virginia Capes for more training maneuvers. Then she returned to the New York Navy Yard again on December 12th for even more maintenance. Repairs were completed within a month, and on January 16, 1915, she headed back to the Virginia Capes for further exercises. After that, she would head down to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba for more exercises. She's doing a lot of exercising, is what I'm trying to explain to you. And then she headed back for more training off Hampton Roads on April 7th, followed by another maintenance period at the New York Navy Yard, starting on April 23rd. On June 25th, after repairs were completed again, she headed for Newport, Rhode Island for torpedo practice, as well as tactical maneuvers, which lasted through late August. By August 27th, she was back in Hampton Roads, where she was doing even more exercises. And this cycle of exercises would pretty much continue until the beginning of World War I for the United States. The U.S. declared war on Germany on April 6, 1917, and Arkansas was at the time assigned to Battleship Division 7 that was stationed in Virginia. At first, she patrolled the East Coast and trained gun crews, and that lasted for 14 months. But after that, she was sent over the Atlantic to Britain in July of 1918 to relieve USS Delaware, her cousin. And while approaching the Royal Navy base in Rosyth, she actually fired upon what she thought was a periscope from a German U-boat. The destroyers that were with her also dropped death charges, but no hits were affected on this apparent submarine. It's still not clear if there ever was one at all. Arkansas would arrive in Rosyth on July 28th and join Battleship Division 9. And for the remainder of World War I, the division would operate as the 6th Battle Squadron of the Grand Fleet. But not much was going on naval-wise at that point in World War I, so Arkansas, beyond possibly seeing a U-boat and shooting at it, didn't really do much of anything. On November 11th, the armistice would go into effect, and the terms of that required Germany to intern a significant portion of the High Seas Fleet in Scapa Flow. Arkansas and a few other American warships participated in the internment and escorted multiple German vessels into Scapa Flow. On December 1st, Battleship Division 9 would be detached from the Grand Fleet, after which Arkansas departed the Firth of Forth for the Isle of Portland. She then went to sea to meet up with the ocean liner George Washington, which was carrying President Wilson to Europe. she would assist in escorting that ship into Brest, France on December 13th, and after that, she headed back to New York City, arriving on December 26th, where she participated in a naval review for the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels. And now we enter the interwar period, where you don't expect much to be going on, but interestingly, Arkansas was remarkably busy during this time. A lot of her time was caught up in doing regular training exercises, which is obvious enough, but there were actually quite a few notable events during the next 20 or so years. After she returned to the US, she actually went into dry dock at Norfolk for an extensive overhaul, after which she'd rejoin the fleet for training exercises off of Cuba, and then crossed the Atlantic again, bound for Europe. She reached Plymouth on May 12, 1919, and then took weather observations on May 19th, after which she would serve as a reference vessel to guide the Navy Curtiss NC flying boats that were flying from Trepassey Bay, Newfoundland, to Europe. After she completed this particular task, she steamed to Brest on June 10th and picked up Admiral William S. Benson, who was the Chief of Naval Operations at the time, as well as his wife, and she carried them both back to New York. On July 19th, Arkansas would depart Hampton Roads to join her new assignments over in the Pacific. She headed for San Francisco, arriving on September 6th via the Panama Canal, where she took aboard both Secretary Daniels and his wife. She took them to Blakely Harbor, Washington on September 12th, and then the following day participated in a naval review for President Wilson. On September 19th, she entered Puget Sound Navy Yard for a general overhaul, and she'd be returned to the fleet in May of 1920 for training operations off of California. It's probably worth mentioning that when Arkansas was built, the hull classification system wasn't actually in place for the Navy. So on July 17th, that's when she was given her designation, BB-33. She then headed to Hawaii in September for her first visit to the islands, and in early 1921, she'd actually visit Chile, where she'd be received by President Arturo Alessandri Palma, and her crew would man the rail to honor the Chilean president. In August of 1921, she actually returned to the Atlantic to become the flagship of the Commander Battleship Force Atlantic Fleet. Throughout the 1920s, she would carry midshipmen from the United States Naval Academy on summer cruises. She went on a tour of Europe in 1923, and she stopped in Copenhagen on July 2nd, where she was visited by King Christian X of Denmark. She also stopped off in Lisbon and Gibraltar. Another midshipman cruise to Europe followed in 1924, which lasted for the next year and went to the west coast of the United States. On June 30th, 1925, she stopped off in Santa Barbara, California, to actually assist in the aftermath of the 1925 earthquake. She would send detachments ashore to help the police in Santa Barbara, and they established a temporary radio station in the city. After returning from her 1925 cruise, she'd be modernized at the Philadelphia Navy Yard. She had her 12 old coal-fired boilers replaced with 4 oil-fired models, which would be trunked into a larger single funnel. She had more deck armor added to protect her from plunging fire, and a short tripod mast was installed in place of her aft cage mast. Her modernization would be complete on November 1926, after which she conducted a shakedown cruise in the Atlantic, and then returned to Philadelphia, where she ran acceptance trials before she could rejoin the fleet. On September 5th, 1927, she was present for ceremonies unveiling a memorial tablet that was honoring French soldiers and sailors who died during the Yorktown campaign in 1781. She would return to her general training exercises in May of 1928, when she took another crew of midshipmen into the Atlantic along the East Coast, as well as for a trip down to Cuba. In June, she would participate in a joint Army-Navy coast defense exercise, and actually served as the hostile attacking fleet during these war games. In early 1929, Arkansas cruised in the Caribbean and near the Canal Zone. She'd returned to the United States in May of 1929 for another overhaul in the New York Navy Yard. After that, she was training some more, because that's just what she did. A lot. Do you even lift like Arkansas? And after that, she'd operate with the scouting fleet off the East Coast. In February of 1931, she participated in Fleet Problem 12, and during those maneuvers, she served as Admiral Arthur L. Willard's flagship, and she was sunk by a submarine. Not really, but as part of the game, she lost. And a month later, she'd actually participate in some exercises with the carriers, Lexington and Saratoga. Then she participated in the Yorktown sesquicentennial celebrations in October of 1931, marking the 150th anniversary of the Siege of Yorktown. She embarked President Herbert Hoover and his entourage on October 17th and took them to the exposition, as well as taking them back to Annapolis on the 19th and 20th of October. After this, she went into dry dock again for another refit in the Philadelphia Navy Yard, which lasted until January of 1932. When she was done, she was transferred back to the Pacific, though by late 1934, she'd be back in the Atlantic again. She's just all over the place. It doesn't matter. They're just whatever. Another major overhaul would happen in the spring of 1936, and after that did more midshipman cruises. But after World War II broke out in September of 1939, Arkansas was moored at Hampton Roads, preparing to depart on another training cruise for the Naval Reserve. She departed to transport a seaplane mooring and aviation equipment from Norfolk to Narragansett Bay, where the Navy planned to set up a seaplane base. While in Newport, Arkansas picked up ordnance for destroyers and brought it back to Hampton Roads. After she returned to Virginia, she was assigned to a reserve force for the neutrality patrols in the Atlantic, alongside her sister, Wyoming, as well as her cousins, New York and Texas. They also had the carrier, Ranger, alongside them. On January 11th, 1940, Arkansas, alongside New York and Texas, would leave for fleet maneuvers off of Cuba. She underwent another overhaul between March 18th and May 24th. After that, she conducted another midship training cruise, along again with Texas and New York. They're all hanging out. And they went to Panama and Venezuela. In late 1940, she conducted 3 Naval Reserve training cruises, also in the Atlantic. Very late that year, December 19th, 1940, with 500 reservists on board, she actually had a bit of an accident. At 300 hours, Arkansas would collide with another ship, Collier Melrose, of the Mystic Steamship Company of Boston, off of Seagirt, New Jersey. It wasn't a severe impact. Arkansas was actually completely fine, just some scratched paint and a smashed lifeboat. But the Collier Melrose was not so lucky. Her below-water plates had been cracked, and she sank just short of a Brooklyn dry dock after she steamed 40 miles to try to make it back to port. A sad situation for her, but there were more pressing matters at the time. Arkansas was assigned to the escort force for the Marines deployed to occupy Iceland in July of 1941, alongside New York, 2 cruisers and 11 destroyers. The task force deployed from NS Argentia, Newfoundland on July 1st, and they were back in port by July 19th. Starting on August 7th, Arkansas went on further neutrality patrols in the mid-Atlantic that would last a week. After she returned to port, she traveled to the Atlantic Charter Conference with President Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, which took place on board HMS Prince of Wales. While there, the U.S. Undersecretary of State, Sumner Welles, decided to stay aboard Arkansas. She would conduct yet another neutrality patrol between the 2nd and 11th of September. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and caused the United States to enter World War II, Arkansas was anchored in Casco Bay, Maine. Just a week after that happened, she would be sent back to Iceland, and then head to Boston on January 24th, 1942. She would start conducting training maneuvers to prepare her crew for the war ahead. At the time, they were focusing on convoy escort duties. On March 6th, she'd arrive in Norfolk to begin another overhaul. Her secondary battery would be reduced to 6 5-inch guns, and she'd be given 36 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft guns in quad mounts, and 26 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft guns were added. Her complement of 3-inch guns was increased from 8 to 10, and the work lasted till July 2nd, after which she conducted a shakedown cruise in the Chesapeake Bay, and then proceed to New York, arriving on July 27th. There, she would become the flagship of Task Force 38, which was to escort a convoy of 12 transports that were bound for Scotland. The convoy arrived in Greenock, on August 17th, and Arkansas headed back to New York on September 4th, where she almost immediately took yet another convoy across the Atlantic to Scotland, being back in New York by October 20th. But thereafter, convoys were actually sent to North Africa to support the invasion. Arkansas would cover her first convoy that was heading down there, alongside 8 destroyers on November 3rd. When she returned to New York by the middle of September, she went into dock for another overhaul. On January 2nd, 1943, she headed back out to conduct gunnery training in the Chesapeake Bay. She was back in New York by January 30th, to prepare to return to convoy escort duty. She'd escort 2 convoys to Casablanca between February and April before she returned to New York, where she was back in dry dock again, which lasted until May 26. She then returned to her duty as a training ship for midshipmen based at Norfolk. After 4 months of that, she was sent back for convoy escort, and on October 8th she steamed to Bangor, Northern Ireland. She remained there through November, departing on December 1st, bound for New York yet again. When she got there, she headed back into dock for even more repairs, and then returned to Norfolk on December 27th. She escorted another convoy bound for Ireland on January 19th, 1944, before heading back to New York again. She's in New York a lot. The beginning of spring saw her doing another round of gunnery drills, after which she went to Boston for more dry dock work. On April 18th, she departed for Northern Ireland, where she started training for a new task: shore bombardment. She had been assigned to the shore bombardment force for Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of northern France. She was assigned to Group 2, alongside Texas and 5 destroyers. Her floatplane artillery observer pilots were actually temporarily assigned to Voss 7, flying Spitfires from RNAS Leon Salent, or HMS Daedalus. On June 3rd, she left her moorings, and on the morning of June 6th took up a position about 4,000 yards from Omaha Beach. At 5:52, she opened fire and bombarded German positions around Omaha Beach for 10 days, until June 13th, when she was moved to support ground forces in Grand Camp Lebanes. On June 25th, she bombarded Cherbourg in support of an American attack on the port. German coastal guns actually straddled her several times, but never managed to actually hit. Cherbourg fell to the Allies the following day, after which Arkansas would return to port, first in Weymouth, England, and then to Bangor, Northern Ireland on June 30th. On July 4th, Independence Day, America, she departed Northern Ireland for the Mediterranean Sea, and she'd reached Oran, Algeria on July 10th, before proceeding on to Toronto, arriving on July 21st. There she joined the support force for Operation Dragoon, which was the invasion of southern France. Again, she would bombard the shore heavily, beginning on August 15th. The bombardment lasted for 2 days, after which she'd withdraw, first to Palermo and then to Oran. After this, she actually headed back to the United States, arriving in Boston on September 14th, where she underwent yet another refit that lasted till early November. Then it was decided to send her over to the Pacific. She steamed to California via the Panama Canal and spent the rest of the year conducting training there. On January 20th, 1945, she left California to Pearl Harbor, then to Ulithi, to join the fleet in preparations for the amphibious assault on Iwo Jima. She was assigned to Task Force 54, which included 5 other battleships, 4 cruisers, and 16 destroyers. On February 16th, Arkansas was in position off of Iwo Jima, and at 600 hours, she opened fire on Japanese positions on the island's west coast. The bombardment would last for 3 days, though she would remain off the island throughout the entire battle, ready to provide fire support to the Marines when requested. She would finally leave on March 7th, bound for Ulithi, and arrive on March 10th, where she was rearmed and refueled in preparation for the invasion of Okinawa. She left Ulithi on March 21st and arrived off of Okinawa 4 days after that, when she then began that bombardment, along with the rest of Task Force 54. The soldiers and Marines went ashore on April 1st, and Arkansas continued to provide support to them over the course of 46 days throughout the Battle of Okinawa. Kamikazes repeatedly attacked her, but never managed to hit. She would leave the island in May, arriving in Guam on May 14th. She then proceeded to Leyte Gulf on June 12th, arriving 4 days later. There she'd be assigned to Task Group 95.7, alongside Texas and 3 cruisers. She remained in the Philippines until August 20th, when she departed for Okinawa, arriving in Buckner Bay on August 23rd. By that time, Japan had surrendered, and the war was over. During the course of it, Arkansas personally was awarded 4 battle stars. Work wasn't quite over for Arkansas, though. She would participate in Operation Magic Carpet, the repatriation of American servicemen from the Pacific. She took around 800 servicemen back home to the United States, departing on September 23rd and reaching Seattle, Washington on October 15th. She actually made another 3 Magic Carpet trips between Pearl Harbor and the continental United States to ferry more soldiers home. And during the first months of 1946, Arkansas was sitting in San Francisco. She was an old battleship, an old-style dreadnought, and unfortunately, dreadnoughts in particular were starting to be seen as obsolete. The Navy was also looking to downsize, and it was decided that Arkansas would be one of many ships utilized for Operation Crossroads, the atomic bomb tests conducted at Bikini Atoll. In late April, she got underway to Hawaii and reached Pearl Harbor on May 8th. She left it on May 20th and headed to Bikini Atoll. Now, we've talked about some other battleships that were a part of these particular atomic bomb tests. Nevada, Pennsylvania, and New York were all there too, and they survived both blasts. But Arkansas wasn't so fortunate. On July 1st, the first test, Able, which was an airburst, didn't actually manage to sink her, but did do extensive shock damage to her upper workings. And on July 25th, she was finally sunk by the underwater nuclear test, Baker. And you might think this would reflect badly on the Wyoming class as a whole, but in Arkansas's defense, she was only 250 yards from the epicenter of the blast, and she was described as appearing to have been crushed as if by a tremendous hammer blow from below. It's believed that a wave of water from the blast capsized her, and then she was hammered down into the shallow bottom by the descent of the water column thrown up by the blast. Her wreck lies inverted in only about 180 feet of water in the bottom of Bikini Lagoon, where she now acts as an artificial reef. She was struck from the Naval Vessel Register on August 15th of 1946. And interestingly, one of the best preserved elements of USS Arkansas, besides her wreck, is actually the Arkansas state flag. Yes, really. The ship was the catalyst for the creation of the flag. Back in 1912, the Daughters of the American Revolution, or DAR, decided that they wanted to present 3 flags to the battleship as she was nearing her commission date. The 3 flags they chose were the American flag, the Navy Battalion Ensign, and a state flag. But when the DAR learned that at the time that Arkansas didn't actually have an official state flag, they decided to hold a statewide competition to come up with one. The winning design was from Willie Cavanaugh Hawker of Pine Bluff, Arkansas, who was also a member of the DAR. And on February 26, 1913, with a few alterations, Hawker's design became the official flag of Arkansas and was thereafter presented to the battleship that bore the state's name. Though her end is unceremonious, she served faithfully for a long time. I find that USS Arkansas often isn't brought up much in conversation, perhaps because she didn't have that many epic escapades, but she still served faithfully and deserves to be remembered. USS New York, or BB-34, was the first of the New York-class battleships, and the big sister of the last dreadnought, USS Texas. Or at least you'd think so, given the fact that they're called the New York class, but construction on New York actually began after Texas, and she wouldn't be commissioned until after her either. So, despite the name, New York is actually Texas's little sister. But in any event, USS New York had a standard displacement of 27,000 tons and a full load displacement of 28,822 tons. She was 573 feet long, with a beam of 95 feet 6 inches and a draft of 28 feet 6 inches. Her power was supplied by 14 Babcock and Wilcox boilers that drove 2 dual-acting vertical triple expansion reciprocating steam engines. This gave her about 28,000 shaft horsepower, and this drove her to a maximum speed of 21 knots. She had a range of 7,060 nautical miles at 10 knots. Her armament consisted of 10 14-inch guns that could be elevated to 15 degrees, and they were arrayed in 5 double mounts that were designated from bow to stern 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The New York class as a whole was the last one to feature a turret mounted amidships, and as built, she carried 21 5-inch guns as her secondary armament, but it would be reduced to just 16 guns in 1918. And the New York class wasn't actually designed with anti-aircraft in mind at all. Later, 2 3-inch guns were added also in 1918 to allow her to perform that duty as well, and she had 4 21-inch torpedo tubes. Her crew complement consisted of 1,042 officers and enlisted men, and they were protected by an armor belt that ranged from 10 to 12 inches. Her lower casemate had between 9 and 11 inches, and her upper casemate had about 6 inches of armor. The deck armor was 2 inches thick, and the turret armor was 14 inches on the face, 4 inches on the top and 2 inches on the sides, 8 inches in the rear. New York was laid down on September 11th, 1911, in the New York Navy Yard in Brooklyn, so she's yet another battleship that was built in her namesake state. Interestingly, the New Yorks as a class were actually constructed under brand new labor laws that limited the working hours of the crews, and on top of that, it was stipulated that each ship cost less than $6 million, not including the cost of armor and armament. She would be launched on October 30th, 1912, and officially commissioned May 15th, 1914, just 2 months after Texas. She was the 5th ship to be named for New York State, and she was sponsored by Elsie Calder, who was the daughter of New York politician William M. Calder. And she's also not to be confused with her immediate predecessor. The 4th New York, which was an armored cruiser, was renamed Rochester so they could use New York for the battleship. And Rochester would later be scuttled in Subic Bay in 1941, and that wreck site, which has become a pretty popular recreational diving location, is still commonly referred to as USS New York, but it is not the same ship as the one we're talking about today. Following her commissioning, she was under the command of Captain Thomas S. Rogers, and she headed out straight for Veracruz. She was designated the flagship for Rear Admiral Frank Friday Fletcher in July of 1914, and he was commanding the fleet that was occupying and blockading Veracruz to prevent arms shipments from arriving there to support the government of Victoriano Huerta, who had risen to power via coup. Eventually, the U.S. occupation of Veracruz ended, and New York was allowed to resume her actual shakedown cruise along the east coast of the United States. During this time, she also did some goodwill duties, and in December of 1915, she actually held a high-profile Christmas party and dinner for several hundred orphans from New York City, at the suggestion of her crew. It's actually really wholesome, though. Because of this, it later became a tradition on the ship to help the underprivileged when possible, earning New York the nickname Christmas Ship. I think I'm uploading this in December. I actually did not plan that at all. Following her initial Christmas party, she undertook a number of training exercises off the Atlantic coast before eventually the United States would find themselves involved in World War I. Now, before I get into New York's role in World War I have a brief explanation to give. See, I have an uncle, a great uncle D. He was a Marine, and he served on board USS New York during World War I. Now, in most cases, I probably wouldn't even mention this because relating my own personal attachment to the ship does seem a little bit too sidetracky, and we're just trying to go over her history, but I actually have a very good reason for it today. See, my Uncle D took with him on the ship a camera. he took pictures. A lot of pictures of the ship, on the ship, and from the ship. These pictures, as far as I understand it, have remained in the family and haven't been published anywhere. Meaning I am now in possession of pictures taken during World War I by a crew member of USS New York that very few people have actually seen. As someone who researches history, having access to this sort of thing really excites me, I'm not gonna lie. I am now able to share images of the past that most didn't even believe existed. Heck, honestly, I didn't even know my family had them until just a couple weeks ago when my dad told me, and I contacted my aunt, who kindly sent me some scanned digital versions. So every picture you're gonna see during this segment on World War I was brought back by my great Uncle D. And I guess I just thought you ought to know that this is kind of exclusive content we got going on here today. It's exciting! New York would be under the command of Edward L. Beach Sr., and she would be the flagship of Battleship Division 9, which was commanded by Rear Admiral U. Rodman. She was sent to reinforce the British Grand Fleet in the North Sea, and she arrived at Scapa Flow on December 7, 1917. The U.S. fleet was assigned to the 6th Battle Squadron in the Grand Fleet, and performed mostly blockade and escort duties. Now, in earlier documentaries about other battleships, you probably noticed, and I've mentioned it, that U.S. ships really didn't get to do much during World War I, since there just wasn't a lot going on naval-wise by the time we got involved. New York is a little bit of an exception. In December of 1917, New York took part in several gunnery exercises, and she scored the highest of the ships for her main battery, with an accuracy of 93.3%. In fact, she was overall the best performer of all the exercises they did. She was the only one that was rated as excellent, while the other ships all received fairly mediocre performance reviews. And though New York didn't fire any shots in anger during World War I, she did sink an enemy vessel. Not on purpose, but she did do it. See, during one of her escort missions, convoy actually came under 2 different attacks by German U-boats. On the evening of October 14th, 1918, as New York was leading a group of battleships into the Pentland Firth, she found herself jostled violently by an impact on her starboard side. She was hit again on the stern that wound up breaking off 2 blades on one of her propellers, and that reduced her to 1 engine and a speed of only 12 knots. Everyone on board knew that she must have hit something, but didn't believe it could have been a shipwreck or anything because of the depth of the channel. The commanders therefore concluded that New York must have accidentally hit a U-boat and sunk it. But she did it, okay? A win's a win, people. This incident marks the only time in all of Battleship Division 9's service with the Grand Fleet that one of the ships sank a German vessel, and it wasn't even on purpose. In terms of which U-boat that would have been, well, examination of German records showed that it may have been UB-113 or UB-123, but there's problems with both of these options. See, UB-113 had apparently been sunk by a French gunboat in the Gulf of Gascony weeks beforehand, and UB-123 sank in the North Sea mine barrage 5 days after New York had hit a sub. So basically what I'm trying to say is that we have no idea which U-boat New York was responsible for sinking. But the U-boat sunk, and New York didn't, so hey. But she did take significant damage from the impact, so she sailed to Rosyth under escort for repairs on October 15th. At 1 o'clock the next morning, another U-boat launched 3 torpedoes at New York, but all of them passed ahead of her. And this wasn't a false alarm or anything. My great uncle insisted this absolutely happened and that he was the one who spotted the torpedoes first. Although my dad says he was always bitter about this because I guess a lieutenant took credit for it over him. And according to most sources, it says a number of officers and men spotted them. I'm getting conflicting reports is what I'm trying to say, but there were definitely torpedoes fired at New York that night. But they missed either way, and it's believed this might have been at least partially due to the wounded nature of New York's situation. Remember, she could only make 12 knots, and standard procedure was actually to go at 16 knots. The U-boat may have misjudged where New York was gonna wind up. And regardless, she did make it to dry dock in Rosyth. And once she was there, it was noticed that there was a very large dent, remarkably similar to the shape of a submarine bow, in her hull. On top of all this, she actually hosted several foreign dignitaries during her time, including King George V of the UK and Edward VIII, and Prince Hirohito of the Empire of Japan as well. New York in particular was interesting to a lot of European powers, as in most cases it was their chance to see an American dreadnought up close, which they hadn't had before. They certainly would have been curious to see how we were developing the technology. She was in fact in the Firth of Forth when the surrender of the German High Seas Fleet took place on November 21st, 1918, which was several days after the signing of the armistice. Once this was completed, she was able to sail back to the United States, but only briefly, because then she escorted the SS George Washington, which carried Woodrow Wilson on his trip from the United States to France for the Paris Peace Conference. New York wouldn't be back in the US until 1919, and that is when we get really started with, well, the interwar period. Always an exciting time, isn't it? At this point, her duties consisted mostly of training and patrolling, though she did see a refit in the Norfolk Navy Yard, where 5 of her 5-inch guns were removed, and she was given 3 additional 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. In late 1919, she actually wound up sailing to the Pacific via the Panama Canal, and it was here that she joined with the newly formed United States Pacific Fleet. She still conducted training and patrol duties over there. In fact, she would keep doing that in the Pacific until the mid-30s, with the major exception being in 1926 when she was sent to the Norfolk Navy Yard for a complete refit. Now, New York and Texas were both considered pretty obsolete by this point. They were super dreadnoughts, and several of their cousins would actually be scrapped or converted for just training purposes about this time. But both New York and Texas were chosen to be overhauled instead, to increase their speed, armor, armament, and propulsion systems as allowed by the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922. As such, in New York's case, she was given an additional 3,000 tons of armor for defense against aerial targets and submarines. The number of 3-inch anti-aircraft guns was increased to 8, and 6 of the 5-inch guns were relocated to new casemates on her main deck. The torpedo tubes were taken off entirely, and her 14 coal-fired boilers were replaced with 6 Burrow Express oil-fired boilers, and her twin funnels were trunked into just 1 after the forward superstructure. The lattice masts were replaced with tripod masts, and the forward tripod was given a control tower on top. Another tower was built amidships, which contained additional fire control to back up the system on the foremast, and a new aircraft catapult was installed atop turret number 3, and she was given cranes for boat and aircraft handling. Her beam would be widened to 106 feet, and she was given anti-torpedo bulges. But these changes did come at a bit of a cost. The bulges actually made maneuvering harder for her at low speeds, and she liked to roll pretty badly. Her gun-firing accuracy was reduced in rough seas, but she would still be sent back out regardless with these changes. On September 4th, 1928, she headed out for short-range battle drills with USS Arizona, and for the 7th to the 10th of November, those two would travel over to San Francisco alongside USS Pennsylvania. On April 3rd, 1929, she would undertake anti-aircraft practice with Arizona again, before heading to Cuba alongside Pennsylvania again, where they stayed until they went to Hampton Roads on May 1st. But she would wind up back in the Pacific as part of the series of fleet problems until 1937. It was at that point she was selected to carry Admiral Rodman, who was President Roosevelt's personal representative for the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. As a result, New York would take part in the Grand Naval Review of May 20th, 1937 as the sole U.S. Navy representative. That same year, 8 1.1-inch guns in 2 quadruple mounts were added to improve her anti-aircraft capabilities, and she would be fitted with XAF radar in February 1938, which actually included the first United States duplexer, which is a device that allows bi-directional communication over a single path. That meant a single antenna could both send and receive information for the ship. This also made her the second ship to be outfitted with radar after the destroyer Leary, and tests conducted on New York would lead to similar radars being installed on the Brooklyn-class and St. Louis-class cruisers, as well as the battleship USS West Virginia. But as far as New York was concerned, for several years she would serve primarily as a training ship for midshipmen, as well as newly enlisted sailors. In September 1939, she did wind up joining the Neutrality Patrol, however, an assignment that saw her safeguarding sea lanes in the North Atlantic, and she served as flagship with the Atlantic Squadron, which would later be redesignated the United States Atlantic Fleet. She remained in that role for the next 27 months. In July of 1941, she did protect a convoy of U.S. troops moving to garrison Iceland, and the day the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, and brought the U.S. officially into World War II, New York was in the middle of a refit. As a result of the attack, New York's overhaul was sped up quite a bit, and she was finished and ready for action just 4 weeks after Pearl Harbor. She immediately returned to escort duty, helping to bring cargo and troops to Iceland and Scotland. And for the next year, she would remain on patrol, wandering about the Atlantic, occasionally escorting convoys. The exception being when she was put in for another overhaul in Norfolk. Her secondary battery would be reduced to just 6 5-inch guns, and her anti-aircraft armament was increased to 10 3-inch guns, as well as 24 40mm Bofors guns and quad mounts, and 42 20mm Oerlikons. It wouldn't be until November of 1942 that New York would see her first real action, during Operation Torch, which was the Allied invasion of French North Africa. She left Norfolk on October 23rd to join the fleet, and she was attached to the Southern Attack Group. On November 8th, New York, alongside the cruiser USS Philadelphia, while being screened by 6 destroyers, attacked Safi Harbor in Morocco, to support landings by the U.S. 9th Infantry Division's 47th Infantry Regiment. And they also defended the transports Cole and Bernadou, which came under attack by 130mm shore batteries. New York would fire several salvos with her 14-inch guns, and one of them did strike the base of the battery and ricochet into a bunker, which destroyed the rangefinder and killed the battery commander, neutralizing the whole thing. Other shore batteries were also destroyed by Philadelphia about this time, as well as the aircraft from the escort carrier Santi. New York, though, would remain on station until the port was secure, and then she headed north to support the center group off of Fedhala and Casablanca. She was actually sent more specifically to deal with another battleship, the Vichy French Jean Bart. But by the time she arrived, her job had already been done for her. Her cousin, USS Massachusetts, had taken care of Jean Bart, and smaller Vichy French ships had been forced away by both USS Brooklyn and USS Augusta. But New York still remained off the coast of North Africa until the beaches were secure, and then she would retire on November 14th. She fired a total of 60 rounds from her main battery during her supporting role, and she headed back to Norfolk on November 23rd. After that, she returned to convoy patrol, and remained doing that until 1943, when she was selected for another refit to turn her into a main battery and escort training center. She arrived in Portland, Maine on May 2nd, and she would stay there until July 27th. Her anti-aircraft battery was increased to 10 3-inch guns, 40 40mm, and 36 20mm guns. She was given improved fire control, and that ultimately increased her displacement to 29,810 tons standard load and 35,000 tons at full load. She headed back to Norfolk on August 2nd, 1943, and she was used primarily to train crews from the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Coast Guard, as well as other allies on how to use pretty much all the guns she had. While this role may not seem as valiant as being in the battle as Texas was around this time, it was exceedingly important. The crews needed to be trained properly in order to fight effectively. And between July 1943 and June of 1944, roughly 11,000 enlisted men and 750 officers would train on New York. But New York's actual crew started losing morale. over time, the Navy would receive a large number of requests for transfer. And the reason might be fairly obvious. Training just wasn't as valiant. The crew of New York didn't want to sit around and train other people to fight. They wanted to fight. That was their job. That's what they were there for. And for nearly a year, all she'd done was sit and train, when her crew felt they should be out there fighting. Texas certainly was. Why couldn't they? Well, following the training duties, she was sent to the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, and it was there she undertook 3 consecutive midshipman cruises that would ferry a total of 1,800 midshipmen from Annapolis to Trinidad between June and August of 1944. And right after this, she would finally get her chance to return to actual battle. The Navy opted to send New York over to the Pacific Theater in late 1944, and she transited the Panama Canal on November 27th, arriving in Long Beach, California on December 9th. Though she actually suffered a breakdown on the way, and lost an observation plane in some bad weather. But she still made it. She was ready. She was here. Yeah, she might be a little old, and a little cranky, and a little downright grumpy. But she was gonna fight regardless, after conducting some refresher training. Of course, off the coast of Southern California in December 1944 and January 1945. But on January 12th, New York finally departed and rendezvoused with her fellow battleships, Idaho, Tennessee, Nevada, Arkansas, and her big sister Texas, to form a support force for the invasion of Iwo Jima. Though New York had lost a blade off her port screw just before the invasion started. Can we hold it together, guys? Please? And that meant she had to be put in for temporary repairs in Etiwettek from the 5th to the 7th of February. But she returned to the group, which was near Saipan on February 11th, and together they would arrive at Iwo Jima on February 16th to begin the pre-invasion bombardment. And boy howdy did New York bombard! During the 3 days this went on, New York expended 6,417 rounds, which included 1,037 14-inch rounds. And one of her salvos managed to strike the primary ammunition dump on the island, which, according to witnesses, caused the most spectacular secondary explosion in the entire campaign. Satisfied with her fireworks display, New York would retire from the area on February 19th and arrived at Ulithi on February 21st. She would receive permanent repairs for her propeller at Manus from February 28th to March 19th, and then she was able to rejoin Task Force 54 at Ulithi on March 22nd. They were preparing for the invasion of Okinawa. This time she joined up with the Colorado classes. Colorado, Maryland, and West Virginia were all together with New York, and they began their bombardment of Okinawa on March 27th. Counting this bombardment process as well as later artillery support for ground forces, New York would remain on station for 76 consecutive days. During that time, she expended 4,159 rounds of 14-inch ammunition and 7,001 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. She did get attacked by a kamikaze on April 14th, which managed to destroy one of her spotting planes. But the Japanese aircraft only managed to hit that, not New York herself. The kamikaze actually would wind up crashing about 50 yards from New York, only leaving her with some superficial damage, as well as 2 men who were injured. She was then detached on June 11th, as she had fired her guns so much that she had worn them out, and she had to go back to Pearl Harbor to have her guns relined in preparation for the invasion of mainland Japan. She would stop by Leyte on June 14th, and then arrive at Pearl Harbor by July 1st. She was still in Pearl when Japan finally surrendered. During her service in World War II, New York spent a total of 1,088 days in the Atlantic and 276 days in the Pacific. She would expend a total of 53,094 rounds of all types, traveled a grand total of 123,867 miles, spent 414 days underway, and consumed 22,367,996 U.S. gallons of fuel oil. She would receive 3 battle stars for her service. When the war was over, New York did participate in Operation Magic Carpet, the repatriation of U.S. servicemen to the United States. She left Pearl Harbor for this on September 2nd and arrived at San Pedro on September 9th with a load of veterans. But after this, she went to New York City and did get to take part in Navy Day celebrations. But New York would not last very long after this, while her big sister Texas got very lucky and wound up being preserved, currently undergoing another refurbishment. As of the making of this video, New York was sadly not so fortunate. She would be selected as a test ship for Operation Crossroads. That's right, the nuclear weapon test conducted by the United States at Bikini Atoll in mid-1946. She, just like Nevada and Pennsylvania, would wind up taking 2 nukes to the face. And also just like Nevada and Pennsylvania, New York didn't sink. Because of course she didn't. After both the Able and Baker tests, New York was taken back to Pearl Harbor to study the effects of the blasts on her, and she would remain there for about 2 years. After that, the Navy felt that there was no more information to be gathered from her, and since there was the whole radioactive thing to address, preserving her was no longer an option. So on July 6, 1948, she was towed out to sea and used for target practice, being sunk by several other naval aircraft and ships, right alongside USS Nevada, who suffered the exact same fate. And though the end to her story is unceremonious and rather sad, her legacy, unlike a lot of other ships, still lives on in the form of her sister. USS Texas, as I said, is undergoing current refurbishment, and she stands the test of time as the last dreadnought. And even the Navy themselves still honor Battleship New York to this day. Her stern plate was saved, and is currently on board her successor, USS New York, LPD-21, which is a San Antonio-class amphibious transport dock. Officially brought into commission November 7th, 2009, and in case she sounds familiar, she is the Navy ship that was built using steel that was salvaged from the World Trade Center after the September 11th terrorist attacks. So I think it's safe to say that between her and USS Texas, the legacy of USS New York, BB-34, continues to live on to this day. USS Washington, or BB-56, was one of 2 North Carolina-class fast battleships. Interestingly, she wasn't actually the first battleship named Washington. That was BB-47, the lost member of the Colorado class, but her construction was cancelled due to the Washington Naval Treaty, and she was sunk as a gunnery target in 1924. This Washington was completed. And though the class was named after her sister, North Carolina, again, these birthdays are all screwy. Now, North Carolina was laid down first, but Washington was launched first. And so we've all kind of accepted that that's the birthday of these warships. Well, yeah, that makes her a little bit older, but it was less than 2 weeks prior to North Carolina's launching, so they're basically twins. North Carolina was also commissioned first, a little over a month before Washington. In any event, these ships were actually the first new battleship design that was built under the Washington Naval Treaty System, and as such, her design was bound by the terms of the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936, which added a restriction on her main battery of guns. They could be no larger than 14 inches. The General Board did evaluate a number of different designs that included more traditional super dreadnought ships, but decided to go with the new fast battleship design instead, to be armed with the maximum of 14-inch guns. But after construction was authorized, the United States actually invoked the escalator clause in the treaty that allowed us to increase them to 16-inch guns in the event that any nation refused to sign the treaty. Japan had refused, so, okay, you want to play? We'll play. USS Washington was 728 feet 9 inches long, had a beam of 108 feet 4 inches, and a draft of 32 feet 11.5 inches. Her standard displacement was roughly 36,000 tons, and that could increase to 45,500 tons at full combat load. She was powered by 4 General Electric steam turbines that each drove a single propeller shaft, The steam was provided by 8 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers. She was rated for 121,000 shaft horsepower, and the turbines were intended to push her to a top speed of 28 knots. She had a cruising range of 17,450 nautical miles at a speed of 15 knots. She also carried 3 Vought OS-2U Kingfisher floatplanes that were launched from catapults on her fantail. During peacetime, her crew numbered 1,800 officers and enlisted men, but during World War II, that would increase to 99 officers and 2,035 enlisted. Her main battery consisted of 9 16-inch Mark VI guns and 3 triple turrets on her centerline, 2 of which were placed in a super-firing pair forward. The third one was aft. Her secondary battery consisted of 25-inch dual-purpose guns that were mounted in twin turrets clustered amidships, and as designed, she was equipped with an anti-aircraft battery of 16 1.1-inch guns and 18 50-cal M2 Browning machine guns. But that particular element would be greatly increased during the course of World War II. Her main armor belt was 12 inches thick, and her main armor deck was up to 5.5 inches thick. The main battery gun turrets had 16-inch thick faces and were mounted atop barbettes that were protected with the same thickness. Her conning tower had 14.7-inch thick sides, and her armor layout had actually been designed to repel shots fired from 14-inch guns. And that was kind of a weakness, because since the treaty system broke down before her construction began, they couldn't revise the design to improve her protection against heavier guns. But it was a weakness that both ships were able to work around. Washington's keel was laid down on June 14, 1938, at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. She was launched on June 1, 1940, and commissioned into the fleet on May 15, 1941, beginning her sea trials on August 3rd. But it was discovered very quickly that there was a problem with the North Carolina class as a whole. Both ships suffered from excessive vibration when they were running at high speed. It was revealed that this was because they used 3-bladed screws. Experiments with North Carolina did produce a solution that, well, reduced the problem but never fully resolved it. 2 4-bladed screws on the outer shafts and 2 5-bladed screws on the inboard shafts caused the ships to still vibrate, but not nearly as bad. It was yet another quirk about the North Carolinas that had to be dealt with, and it did mean that neither one could reach their designed speed, so they were a little bit slower than they were originally supposed to be. However, Washington continued her trials either way, and entered her training phase. She would train alongside her sister, in fact, as well as the aircraft carrier USS Wasp. Washington would serve as flagship of Rear Admiral John W. Wilcox Jr., who was the commander of Battleship Division 6, part of the Atlantic Fleet. And Washington's working up training would continue past December 7th, 1941, into the beginning of 1942. By that point, the United States had officially entered World War II. Washington would remain in the Atlantic in the first part of the war. She was assigned as the flagship of Task Force 39, still under Wilcox's command, and the task force headed for Britain on March 26. This unit included Wasp and the heavy cruisers Wichita and Tuscaloosa, and they were meant to reinforce the British home fleet based in Scapa Flow, which had been weakened by their need to detach units to take part in the invasion of Madagascar. And as the title of this video would suggest, Washington bravely fought through a whole bunch of unfortunate events. Her design flaws were bad enough, but on the task force's way to Britain, Rear Admiral Wilcox was swept overboard. Multiple ships were involved in frantically trying to find him, and eventually lookouts on the destroyer USS Wilson did locate the Admiral, but he had already drowned. Rear Admiral Robert C. Giffen, who was aboard Wichita, took command of the unit, and continued on with the mission. They were met at sea by the British cruiser HMS Edinburgh on April 3rd, and they arrived at Scapa Flow 2 days later. For the rest of the month, Washington and the other American ships would take part in a handful of training exercises to familiarize their crews with the operations of the British home fleet, so they would be adequately prepared to work together. In late April, they'd be redesignated Task Force 99, with Washington still being the flagship. and they embarked on their first operation on April 28th to conduct a sweep for German warships ahead of the supply convoy PQ-15, which was headed to the Soviet Union. Elements of the home fleet went along with them, including the battleship HMS King George V, as well as the aircraft carrier Victorious. But during this operation, King George V accidentally rammed into and sank a destroyer, HMS Punjabi. It wasn't really King George's fault. Punjabi's lookout had thought he spotted a mine, and the captain ordered a 15-point emergency turn to port. But that put Leyte directly in the path of King George, and Punjabi was sliced in two, with King George taking serious damage to her bow. But in terms of how this affects Washington, well, she was following very closely behind King George V. And that meant she couldn't actually go around the wreckage. She had to sail in between the pieces of Punjabi. And as she passed over the sinking stern of the destroyer, the depth charges that were on board Punjabi exploded underneath Washington. To Washington's credit, she took this blast like a champ. Her radars and fire control equipment were damaged, and she suffered a small leak in one of her fuel tanks, but it was nothing major, and she could continue on with the mission. King George V was damaged badly enough that she had to go back to port for repairs. Punjabi, of course, sank, with 49 of her crew losing their lives in this unfortunate accident. Washington would stay with the task force until May 5th, before heading over to Iceland, where they would stay until May 15th. Then they headed back to Scapa Flow and arrived there on June 3rd. The next day, Admiral Harold Rainsford Stark, who was the commander of the naval forces in Europe, actually visited Washington and made her his temporary headquarters. On June 7th, King George VI came aboard to inspect Washington personally, and after Admiral Stark left, Washington resumed her escorting duties in the Arctic territories, which included multiple convoys, most of which weren't super notable, as Washington wasn't directly involved, though the one designated PQ-17 deserves some attention, as this was a complete disaster. Reconnaissance reported the KMS Tirpitz, the sister of Bismarck, was actually on her way to attack this convoy, along with the heavy cruisers Admiral Hipper, Admiral Scheer, and Lutzow, as well as 9 destroyers. And while those ships had left their ports to possibly attack a convoy, they were sent back. So, in reality, the Germans weren't even close. But the convoy didn't know that, and the commander ordered his ships to scatter, which, while this was a good tactic against heavy units like Tirpitz, this left them very vulnerable to U-boats and the Luftwaffe, which would wind up sinking 24 of the 35 transport ships. Washington was not directly targeted, but she couldn't do anything to protect any of the transports. While back in Iceland on July 14th, Admiral Giffen would move his flag back to Wichita, and Washington, escorted by 4 destroyers, got underway to head back to the United States. She would arrive at Gravesend Bay on July 21st, and move to the Brooklyn Navy Yard 2 days later for an overhaul. Work on her was completed on August 23rd, and it was decided to send her to the Pacific instead of the Atlantic. Along with an escort of 3 destroyers, she passed through the Panama Canal on August 28th and arrived in Tonga on September 14th, where she'd become the flagship of Rear Admiral Willis Lee, who was then the commander of Battleship Division 6 and Task Group 12.2. On September 15th, Washington headed out to meet the ships of Task Force 17, which were centered around the aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The ships would operate together after that and headed to New Caledonia to begin operations in support of the Solomon Island campaign. Washington would mostly cover convoys that were bringing supplies and reinforcements to the Marines that were fighting on Guadalcanal. During one of those, in mid-October, Washington, along with a pair of cruisers and 5 destroyers, did provide distant support, but were too far away to have a significant impact in the Battle of Cape Esperance on the night of the 11th and 12th. Washington would then be transferred to Task Force 64, which was the surface combatant force assigned to the Guadalcanal area, still under Lee's command. At this point, the unit also included 1 heavy and 2 light cruisers as well as 6 destroyers. Through the 21st to the 24th of October, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft coming from nearby airfields would make repeated contact with the task force as the Japanese fleet was approaching the area, But in the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, which started on the 25th, the Japanese decided to focus their air attacks on American carriers of Task Forces 17 and 61, though Washington would finally be targeted on October 27th, when a Japanese submarine, I-15, tried to hit her with a torpedo, but she missed. By early November, the US fleet had actually been reduced considerably in offensive power. Both carriers Wasp and Hornet had actually been sunk, leaving just USS Enterprise, along with Washington and another battleship, USS South Dakota, as the only capital ships available to the Allied forces in that area. Washington joined both Enterprise and South Dakota in Task Force 16, which did have heavy cruiser Northampton and 9 destroyers. They sortied on November 11th to return to the fighting off of Guadalcanal. Another cruiser, Pensacola, and 2 more destroyers did join them the following day, and on November 13th, after learning that a major Japanese attack was actually approaching, Admiral Halsey detached South Dakota, Washington, and 4 of the destroyers as Task Group 16.3, still under Lee's command. Enterprise had had her forward elevator damaged from the action at Santa Cruz, so she was kept to the south as a reserve, as well as to protect her since she was the only operational American carrier in the Pacific at the time. Task Group 16.3 was meant to block an anticipated Japanese bombardment group in the waters off of Guadalcanal. At the same time that the task group was approaching Guadalcanal, Japanese Admiral Nobutake Kondo was steaming to meet them with his own bombardment force, which consisted of the fast battleship Kirishima, the heavy cruisers Takeo and Atago, as well as multiple destroyers. While en route, Task Group 16.3 would be redesignated Task Force 64 on November 14th, and they passed the south of Guadalcanal and then rounded the western end of the island to block Kondo's expected route. Japanese aircraft did sight Lee's formation, but their identification of the ships in the task force were all over the place. They ranged from a group of cruisers and destroyers to aircraft carriers, neither of which was really accurate, and that caused confusion among the Japanese commanders. That evening, American reconnaissance aircraft did manage to spy the Japanese warships sitting off of Savo Island, and that prompted Lee to order his ships to general quarters. The 4 destroyers he had were arrayed ahead of the 2 battleships. And remember, this task force was just kind of lopped together only a day prior. They hadn't operated together as a unit, and both battleships actually had pretty limited experience shooting their main battery, especially at night, which it was. At around 2300 hours, on November 14th, the leading Japanese destroyers, which were commanded by Shintaro Hashimoto, managed to spy Lee's ships, and turned about to warn Admiral Kondo. On the flip side, Washington's search radar had picked up a Japanese cruiser as well as a destroyer. Her fire control radars began tracking the Japanese vessels, and Lee ordered both of his battleships to open fire when ready. Washington fired first with her main battery at 2317 at a range of 18,000 yards, while her secondary guns fired star shells to help illuminate the targets, and South Dakota would follow up her actions shortly after. One of the Japanese destroyers, Ayanami, actually revealed her position by opening fire on the American destroyer's screen, which allowed Washington to target her. Washington's shots would inflict serious damage that disabled her propulsion machinery, as well as starting a major fire. After that, at 2330, an error in the electrical switchboard room knocked out power aboard South Dakota, and that disabled her radar systems and left her blind. By that point, Hashimoto's ships had actually inflicted serious damage on the American destroyers. 2 of them were torpedoed, and a 3rd had been wrecked by gunfire. Washington was basically alone to engage the Japanese squadron. But the Japanese, at this point, hadn't actually detected Washington. They still didn't know she was there. Washington was captained by Glenn B. Davis, and he decided to keep her on the disengaged side of the flaming wrecks of the destroyer screen. This masks her exact position, but South Dakota was forced to turn in front of one of the burning destroyers to avoid a collision, and that backlit her to the Japanese ships, who immediately fired and caused South Dakota to take a massive beating. But it meant that Washington could shoot back without risk. At 23:35, Washington's SG radar detected Kondo's main force, and they tracked them for the next 20 minutes. At 23:58, South Dakota's power was restored, and her radar picked up the Japanese ships less than 3 nautical miles ahead. 2 minutes later, the lead ship, Otago, illuminated South Dakota with her searchlights, and the Japanese line opened fire, hitting her 27 times. But Washington was still undetected, and she fired back in defense of South Dakota. She allocated 2 of her 5-inch guns on Otago, as well as 2 others to fire star shells, while the rest joined with her main battery and slammed Kirishima at a range of 8,400 yards. It's unknown exactly how many times she hit Kirishima, with around 9 16-inch hits and up to 40 5-inch hits, which absolutely wrecked Kirishima. She was holed below the waterline, and her forward 2 turrets were completely knocked out. Her rudder was also jammed, and that forced her to steer in a circle to port with an increasing starboard list. Washington would then shift fire to Otago and Takeo. She managed to straddle the former, but failed to score any significant hits on them. But amusingly, this barrage was enough to convince both cruisers to turn off their searchlights and reverse course. They were both just like, oh no, we don't want any part of this. This was strategic, however. They were attempting to launch torpedoes. At 0013, the 2 cruisers managed to fire a spread of 16 long-lance torpedoes at Washington at a range of about 4,000 yards, but they all missed her. At 0020, Lee ordered Washington, who at that point was the only functional ship still engaged, to close with Kondo's cruisers. Otago and Takeo briefly engaged with their main batteries, and Otago launched 3 more torpedoes, but those missed. Again, Kondo then ordered the light forces of his reconnaissance screen to make another torpedo attack, but Hashimoto's ships were far out of position at the time and couldn't comply. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who was escorting a supply convoy to Guadalcanal, decided to detach 2 destroyers to help Kondo. But apparently this one battleship, this single battleship, was too much for all of them to handle. But when those ships arrived, Lee ordered Washington to reverse course, and that happened at about 0033 to avoid yet another torpedo attack from those destroyers. Tanaka's 2 destroyers did close and launch their torpedoes while Washington was retreating, as she had to take evasive maneuvers, and in an act of sheer, unbreakable, incredible bravado, Lee decided to withdraw in a slightly different direction from the damaged American warships, to lure the Japanese that were pursuing him away from them. Kondo would cancel the bombardment and attempted to contact Kirishima, but he received no response. He had to send destroyers to investigate, and she was found to be on fire, still turning slowly to port as she was slowly sinking. She did hang on for a decent amount of time, eventually capsizing at 0325. Ayaname had also been abandoned and sank as a result of the damage inflicted by Washington. By 900 hours, Washington was finally able to meet back up with South Dakota, who, though she took a pretty bad beating herself, had managed to survive, alongside 2 surviving destroyers, Benham and Gwyn. Together they withdrew from the area. Washington's incredible stand at what was known as the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal is by and large one of her finest exploits. Not only had she protected one of her fellow battleships and sunk 2 Japanese ships, but the action had not only blocked Kondo's planned bombardment, but delayed Tanaka's convoy late enough that the transports couldn't actually unload under the cover of darkness, so they were forced to beach themselves instead, where they were repeatedly attacked and badly damaged by aircraft from Enterprise and Henderson Field, as well as field artillery and destroyer Meade later that morning. All in all, Washington had done a bang-up job in this particular engagement. And after this, she'd returned to the task of screening the carriers of Task Force 11, which was Saratoga, and Task Force 16, Enterprise, while South Dakota left for much-needed repairs. By late November, Lee's command would be reinforced by Washington's sister, who was also followed up by Battleship Indiana. They were grouped together as Task Force 64, and they would cover convoys to support the fighting in the Solomons into the next year. Washington would remain in the South Pacific until April 30th, when she headed back to Pearl Harbor. On the way there, she joined up with Task Force 16 and arrived on May 8th. For the next 20 days, Washington was operated as the flagship of Task Force 60, which would conduct combat training off the coast of Hawaii. On May 28th, she went into dry dock at the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard for some repairs and installation of brand new equipment. This included a new set of screws that, again, failed to help her vibration issue. She was always shaky. That was just the way she was. But once the work was completed, she resumed training in the area until July 27th, when she headed out with a convoy bound for the South Pacific again. And when she arrived in the area, she was detached on August 5th to proceed alone to Havana Harbor at a fete in the New Hebrides. Washington would spend the next 2 months conducting tactical training with the carrier task forces in the area in preparation for the upcoming campaigns. She was now a part of Task Group 53.2, which included 3 other battleships as well as 6 destroyers. She'd get underway on August 31st, and they met up with Task Group 53.3, which was centered around the carriers Enterprise, Essex, and Independence, and they trained with them until November 5th. The groups then dispersed, and Washington left with the escorting destroyers for the Fiji Islands, which she reached on November 7th. She would sortie on November 11th, and 4 days later, she and the ship she was with joined up with Task Group 50.1, which was centered on the carrier Yorktown. They were heading to the Gilbert Islands, where Marines were preparing to land on Tarawa. The carriers of Task Force 50 launched their strikes on November 19th, and that continued until the next day as Marines went ashore on both Tarawa and Macon. They would steam south on November 22nd to patrol the north area of Macon, and on November 25th, they were reorganized, and Washington was transferred to Task Group 50.4, along with the carriers Bunker Hill and Monterey, as well as Battleship South Dakota, who was freshly repaired, as well as Alabama. From the 26th to the 28th of November, the carrier groups operated off of Macon to cover troop landings there, and Japanese aircraft did attack the groups on the 27th and 28th of November, but they managed to inflict very little damage on the American ships. Fighting in the Gilberts would be over by December 6, and Washington was detached to create Task Group 50.8, along with their sister North Carolina, South Dakota, Alabama, Indiana, and Massachusetts. They would be covered by Bunker Hill, Monterey, as well as 11 destroyers. They were sent to bombard the island of Nauru 2 days later, and returned to a fate on December 12th. They remained there only briefly, though, before they headed out again on Christmas Day, December 25th, for more gunnery training with North Carolina and 4 destroyers. They would return to port on January 7th, 1944, and by that point, Washington was assigned to Task Group 37.2. She gets shuffled around a lot. She was still with Bunker Hill and Monterey, though. The ships got underway on January 18th, heading to the Marshall Islands. They joined up with Task Force 58, which comprised the Fast Carrier Task Force, and that had been created under the command of Rear Admiral Mark Mitscher on January 6. Washington's unit was accordingly renumbered as Task Group 58.1, and they arrived off of Kwajalein by late January. Washington would be in charge of screening carriers while they conducted strikes on the island, as well as the neighboring Tarawa. On January 30th, Washington, Massachusetts, and Indiana were actually detached from the carriers to bombard the island with an escort of 4 destroyers. They would return the following day to resume their guard duty, while the carriers resumed their airstrikes. However, a series of unfortunate events cannot stop affecting Washington. In the early hours of February 1st, Indiana cut in front of Washington to go refuel a group of destroyers, and this caused Washington to ram into her, causing serious damage to both vessels. It had happened because the ships had been blacked out to prevent Japanese observers from spotting them. Indiana had her starboard propeller shaft destroyed, as well as significant damage to her belt armor and torpedo defense system. She also had roughly 200 feet of armor plating torn from her hull. The accident killed 3 men and injured another 6 aboard Indiana, and a subsequent inquiry did blame Indiana, but both were able to stay afloat, withdrawing to Majuro for temporary repairs. Washington's bow was reinforced to allow her to steam to Pearl Harbor on February 11th for further repairs. After arriving there, she was fitted with a temporary bow before she headed to Puget Sound, for actual permanent repairs. She also received another new set of screws, and this resulted in a weird situation for her vibrating. With these, she could now steam at high speed without any significant issues, but vibration was still really bad at speeds between 17 and 20 knots, so she couldn't steam at average speed. You just want to shake, rattle, and roll, don't you, sweetheart? Okay. Once the work was completed, she took on a group of 500 passengers before she headed for Pearl Harbor, arriving there on May 13th, and then proceeding back to the fleet at Majuro. She arrived there on June 7th and resumed her service as the now Vice Admiral Lee's flagship. Shortly after Washington showed up, the fleet headed out to assault the Mariana Islands. The carriers would strike targets on Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Rota, and Pagan to weaken Japanese defenses before ground forces went ashore. She was assigned to Task Group 58.7, which consisted of 7 fast battleships, and they were distributed between the 4 carrier task groups. On June 13th, Washington and several other battleships were actually detached to bombard Saipan and Tinian before they were relieved by the Amphibious Forces Bombardment Group. On June 15th, the Fast Carrier Task Force steamed north to hit targets in the Volcano and Bonin Islands, and that included Iwo Jima, Chichijima, and Hahajima. At the same time, Marines would storm the beaches on Saipan, and that landing was a breach of Japan's inner defensive perimeter that triggered the Japanese fleet to launch a major counterthrust with the 1st Mobile Fleet, their main carrier strike force. The fleet's departure was actually observed by an American submarine, Redfin, and other submarines, which included Flying Fish and Kavala, managed to track the Japanese fleet as it approached, and keep Admiral Raymond Spruance, who was the 5th Fleet commander, informed about exactly where they were. As the Japanese fleet approached, Washington, along with the rest of Task Force 58, steamed to meet it on June 18th, and that led to the Battle of the Philippine Sea on the 19th and 20th of June. Washington and the other battleships, with 4 cruisers and 13 destroyers, were deployed about 15 nautical miles west of the carrier groups to screen the likely path of approach. The Japanese would launch their aircraft first to probe the American fleet's defenses. Washington and her sister were the first battleships to open fire on the attacking Japanese aircraft. During that action, which was fought primarily by the carriers, the U.S. fleet managed to inflict serious damage on the Japanese, destroying hundreds of their aircraft and sinking 3 of their carriers. With the 1st Mobile Fleet completely crippled, Washington and the rest of Task Force 58 returned to the Marianas. She would continue her screening duties during the Battle of Guam until July 25th, when she headed out with the carriers of Task Group 58.4 to raid the Palayu Islands. The attacks lasted until August 6, when Washington, Indiana, Alabama, and the light cruiser Birmingham, along with escorting destroyers, were actually detached as Task Group 58.7 to head to Etiwetik, arriving there on August 11th. They refueled and got more ammo, as battleships tend to have to do, but stayed there for most of the month. On August 30th, they finally got underway again, with the rest of the Fast Carrier Strike Force, which by now had actually been transferred to 3rd Fleet Command, and renumbered Task Force 38. Washington would be assigned to Task Group 38.3. The ships first went south to the Admiralty Islands, and then west, back to the Palayus. The carriers would carry out a series of strikes from the 6th to the 8th of September on various targets there. Washington would utilize her heavy guns to bombard Peleliu and Angawar before the Marines assaulted both those islands. On the 9th and 10th of September, Task Groups 38.1, .2, and .3 left the area to raid Japanese airfields on Mindanao in the southern Philippines, which was part of the standard practice to neutralize nearby positions that could interfere with the upcoming assaults on the Palayus. But they found very few Japanese forces on the island, so the carriers shifted north to the Visayas in the central Philippines from the 12th to the 14th of September. The carrier groups then withdrew to refuel at sea before returning to attack airfields on Luzon from the 21st to the 22nd of September, before they made further attacks on installations on September 24th. Then they proceeded north to make a series of strikes on airfields in Okinawa, Formosa, and Luzon, in preparation for the upcoming invasion of the Philippines. Task Force 38 would embark on the raids to isolate the Philippines and suppress the units of the 1st Air Fleet on October 6. Washington still remained Lee's flagship, attached to Task Group 38.3. The first operation was a major strike on Japanese air bases on the island of Okinawa on October 10th. The following day, the ships of Task Group 38.3 would refuel before joining the other 3 task groups for major raids on Formosa that happened from the 12th to the 14th of October. The fleet would withdraw the following day, but during which they'd have to defend themselves from very heavy Japanese air attacks. But Task Group 38.3 wasn't directly engaged, as the attacks were concentrated on Task Groups Point 1 and Point 4. On the 16th, though, a submarine reported observing a Japanese squadron that consisted of 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers, searching for damaged Allied warships, and Task Groups 38.3 and Point 2 steamed north to catch them, but the aircraft were only able to locate and sink a single torpedo boat. On October 17th, the 2 task groups withdrew to the south to cover the invasion of Leyte, along with the rest of Task Force 38, which was the same day elements of the 6th Army went ashore. The raids on Luzon continued until October 19th. By that time, Washington had been reassigned to Task Group 38.4, screening for Enterprise again, the fleet carrier Franklin, and the light carriers San Jacinto and Belleau Wood. On October 21st, Task Group 38.4 withdrew to refuel, and during that time they also covered the withdrawal of ships that had been damaged during the Formosa raid, which was still on their way to Ulithi. They were recalled to Leyte the following day. The landing on Leyte had led to the activation of Japanese Operation Jogo 1, which was their complicated counterattack to an Allied landing in the Philippines. It involved 3 separate fleets: the first mobile fleet, now labeled the Northern Force under Jisaburo Ozawa, Center Force under Takeo Kurita, and the Southern Force under Shoji Nishimura. Ozawa's carriers had been depleted of most of their aircraft, so they were meant to serve as decoys for Kurita and Nishimura's battleships, which would use the distraction to attack the invasion fleet directly. Kurita's ships were actually detected in the San Bernardino Strait on October 24th, which would lead to the Battle of the Philippine Sea. During that, American carrier aircraft sank Battleship Musashi, which caused Kurita to temporarily reverse course. That would convince Admiral William F. Halsey, who was the commander of the 3rd Fleet, to send the fast carrier task force to destroy the 1st Mobile Fleet, which, remember, was only a diversion. Washington would steam north with the carriers, and on the way Halsey established Task Force 34, which was under Lee's command, consisting of Washington and 5 other fast battleships, 7 cruisers and 18 destroyers. On the morning of October 25th, the first attack on the Northern Force began, and that initiated the battle off Cape Engano. Over the course of 6 strikes on the Japanese fleet, the Americans sank all 4 of the carriers, and damaged 2 old battleships that had been converted into hybrid carriers. But unknown to the American forces up there, Kurita had resumed his approach through the San Bernardino Straits late on October 24th, and passed into Leyte Gulf the following morning. This would lead to the Battle off Samar, where Kurita's forces ran into TU 77.4.3, known as Taffy 3. It was only a group of escort carriers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts against incredibly powerful Japanese battleships, including Yamato, but Taffy 3 was not screwing around. They fought back so hard that Kurita thought he had met up with a fast carrier group, not just escorts, and he wound up retreating. But Taffy 3 took heavy losses, and frantic calls for help led Halsey to detach Lee's battleships to head back south. But Halsey had waited more than an hour after receiving orders from Chester W. Nimitz, who was the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, to actually detach Task Force 34. They were still steaming north during that time, and that added 2 hours to their voyage south. They also had to refuel destroyers, further slowing their progress. Halsey would later detach battleships Iowa and New Jersey as Task Group 34.5 to pursue Kurita, while Lee took the rest of the battleships further southwest to cut off his escape, but they arrived too late. But Taffy 3 had done it on their own. After that, the units of Task Force 38 withdrew to Ulithi to replenish fuel and ammunition for further operations in the Philippines. The carrier forces got back underway on November 2nd for more strikes on the airfields of Luzon and the Visayas that would continue until November 14th, when they headed back to Ulithi again, arriving there 3 days later. On November 18th, Lee finally decided to let go of Washington. He would exchange flagships with Rear Admiral Edward Hanson, who would actually use South Dakota as his flagship, and under his command, Washington was transferred to Task Group 38.3, along with South Dakota as well as her sister North Carolina. They would sortie on November 22nd for gunnery training, while the carriers conducted strikes independently against targets in the Philippines over the next 3 days. They would arrive back at Ulithi again on December 2nd, when they made repairs and loaded more ammunition for future operations. They would get back underway on December 11th for more attacks on Luzon to suppress Japanese aircraft as the amphibious force prepared for their next landing on the island of Mindoro, which was in the western part of the Philippines. The raid would last from the 14th to the 16th of December. The fleet withdrew again to refuel on December 17th. But during that time, Typhoon Cobra would sweep through the area, and it would do significant damage to the fleet, sinking 3 destroyers. It would also delay support of ground troops for 2 days, and the weather wouldn't really get much better, leading Halsey to break off operations. They arrived back in Ulithi on December 24th. On the 30th, the fleet got back underway, though, to make preparatory strikes for the landing on Luzon. Washington would stay with Task Group 38.3 for this operation, and the carriers struck Formosa again on the 3rd and 4th in January 1945. And after they refueled on the 5th, they actually struck kamikazes that had been massed at airfields on Luzon on the 6th and 7th to neutralize them before they had a chance to, well, try to slam into them. Further attacks on Formosa and Okinawa followed on January 9th. And the next day, the carrier groups entered the South China Sea, where they refueled again and then struck targets in French Indochina, on the assumption that significant Japanese naval forces were actually present. But, there were only merchant ships and a few minor warships. While that was going on, other elements of the Allied fleet invaded Lingayen Gulf on Luzon. In February, Washington would escort carriers during attacks on the Japanese islands of Honshu to disrupt Japanese air forces that might try to interfere with the planned invasion of Iwo Jima. The 5th Fleet had resumed command of the Fast Carrier Task Force by that time, and Washington was now a part of Task Group 58.4. They sortied from Ulithi on February 10th, and after conducting some training exercises off of Tinian and refueling at sea, they continued on north to launch strikes on the Tokyo area 2 days later. Those raids continued through February 17th, and the following day the fleet withdrew to refuel, and Task Group 58.4 was sent to hit other islands in the Bonin Chain in an effort to isolate Iwo Jima. During the preparatory bombardment for that, Washington, North Carolina, and the heavy cruiser Indianapolis were actually detached from the task group to reinforce Task Force 54, which was the assault force for the invasion. Washington would remain on station during the marine assault and provided fire support as they fought their way across the island through February 22nd. The day after that, the carrier groups reassembled and refueled on February 24th for further operations against the Japanese mainland. When they left Iwo Jima, they started their air attacks on the home islands to prepare for the amphibious assault on Okinawa. The first of these on the 25th and the 26th of February would strike more targets in the Tokyo area, and that was followed by another attack on Iwo Jima. The fleet was then refueled on February 28th, and on March 1st, they raided Okinawa, returning to Ulithi on March 4th. While there, Washington was transferred to Task Group 58.3, and they sortied on March 14th for more attacks on Japan. These attacks would cause significant damage to Japanese facilities and sank and damaged numerous warships. On March 24th, Washington would bombard Japanese positions on Okinawa as the fleet continued to attack defenses prior to the official invasion. By that point, Washington had been transferred to Task Group 58.2. Carrier raids on the home islands and the Ryukyus continued even after the landing on Okinawa on April 1st. While operating off the island, the fleet would come under heavy and repeated kamikaze attacks. One of the largest took place on April 7th, but Washington wasn't damaged during that time. The attacks were largely defeated by the carrier's combat air patrols. On April 19th, she came in close to Okinawa to bombard Japanese positions as the Marines fought their way to the south. Washington would stay off the island to provide support until late May, when she was detached for a much-needed overhaul. She proceeded first to San Pedro Bay in Leyte, before heading for Puget Sound. While crossing over the Pacific, she did stop off in Guam and Pearl Harbor, before arriving in Bremerton, Washington on June 23rd. Her refit would actually last until September, and by that point, Japan had surrendered, bringing World War II to a close. Washington, as a fast battleship, wasn't scrapped immediately after World War II. She would conduct her sea trials post-refit, as well as go through a short period of training while based in San Pedro, Los Angeles. She then headed for the Panama Canal, and on October 2nd, joined Task Group 11.6, passing through the canal and steaming north to the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, where she was born. She arrived there on October 17th to take part in Navy Day celebrations on October 27th. She was slated to take part in Operation Magic Carpet, and she went into the shipyard in Philadelphia to be modified so she could carry additional personnel. More space was provided by reducing her crew, which didn't need to be as large in peacetime, to just 84 officers and 835 enlisted men. This work was done by November 15th, when she headed across the Atlantic to Britain. She arrived in Southampton on November 22nd, and she would embark with a contingent of Army personnel, totaling 185 officers and 1,479 enlisted men, and then cross the Atlantic again to New York, bringing those men home, and then she would be decommissioned on June 27, 1947. But not scrapped at this point. She was assigned to the Atlantic Reserve Fleet that was based in New York, and she would remain there throughout the 1950s. She wasn't an old-school dreadnought, but she wasn't exactly the best kind of fast battleship that the US had. The Iowas were considered superior, though it was thought that the North Carolina class may have some use in the future. But beginning already in 1946, the ship's characteristics board had authorized the removal of some of the 40mm guns from both the North Carolina and South Dakota class battleships, which were then reinstalled on the Iowas when they were reactivated for the Korean War. Washington and the other battleships had their 20mm batteries removed entirely by October of 1951, but it was considered the Navy might modernize both Washington and North Carolina in May of 1954. But for fast battleships, they were slow. They had that vibration issue, remember, and that prevented them from serving with the carrier task forces. The Navy determined that they had to hit a speed of 31 knots, and to achieve that, they would need a new power plant that could provide 240,000 shaft horsepower at their current displacement. And even if they removed the aft turrets and used that magazine space for additional boilers, it still wouldn't have produced the necessary power. If they removed all their belt armor, which, I mean, they kind of need that, but if they did, they would only require 216,000 shaft horsepower to reach the desired speed. But then the aft hull would have to be significantly rebuilt to even accommodate the larger screws that would be required. They did consider the possibility of removing Washington's propulsion system altogether and replacing it with the same one that was used in the Iowas, which could hit 35 knots. But there wasn't enough room to fit that system. The Iowas were bigger. Washington would have to be rebuilt significantly, and the cost would be around $40 million per ship. That was deemed prohibitively expensive, so the idea was abandoned entirely. They did keep her around until June 1st, 1960, when she was finally stricken from the Naval Vessel Register. She was sold for scrap on May 24th, 1961. She was towed to the Lipset Division of Luria Brothers and broken up. Though Washington may be gone, and we only have her incredible stories left, her sister, North Carolina, is still with us. She was saved for preservation and still serves as a museum ship to this day. In that way, she carries on both her and her amazing sister's legacies. USS North Carolina, or BB-55, is, well, considered the lead ship of the North Carolina-class battleships, but her sister Washington was actually launched first, almost 2 weeks before her. Granted, North Carolina was laid down and commissioned first, so in terms of which one is older, well, argue about that in the comments, though most seem to feel like the launch date should be the birth date, therefore making North Carolina the little sister. But in any event, the North Carolina class was actually the first new battleship design built under the Washington Naval Treaty System. and as such they were bound by the terms of the Second London Naval Treaty of 1936, which added a restriction of her main battery of guns. They could be no larger than 14 inches. North Carolina is not a dreadnought, she is a fast battleship, designed for higher speeds, though still with heavy firepower. Originally meant to have 12 14-inch guns, this was later changed, as after the ships were authorized, the U.S. invoked the escalator clause in the treaty that permitted an increase to 16-inch guns in the event that any member nation refused to sign the treaty. And Japan refused to sign the treaty. So okay, you guys want to play? We'll play. She was 728 feet 9 inches long overall, with a beam of 108 feet 4 inches and a draft of 32 feet 11.5 inches. Her standard displacement was 35,562 tons, and at full load, she would hit 45,519 tons. Her power came from 4 General Electric steam turbines, each driving a single propeller shaft, using steam provided by 8 oil-fired Babcock and Wilcox boilers. She was rated for 121,000 shaft horsepower, and the turbines were intended to give a top speed of 28 knots, 32 miles per hour. She had a cruising range of 17,450 nautical miles at a speed of 15 knots. She also had 3 Vought OS-2U Kingfisher floatplanes for aerial reconnaissance, launched from aircraft catapults on her fantail. Her peacetime crew numbered 1,800 officers and enlisted men, but during World War II, that would increase to 99 officers and 2,035 enlisted men. Her armament consisted of 9 16-inch Mark VI guns, and a trio of 3 gun turrets on her center line, 2 in a super-firing pair forward. Her secondary battery was 20 5-inch dual-purpose guns, mounted in twin turrets clustered amidships. As designed, she was equipped with an anti-aircraft battery of 16 1.1-inch guns and 18 50-cal M2 Browning machine guns, but that would be later expanded during the course of the war. Her main armor belt was 12 inches thick, while the main armor deck is up to 5.5 inches thick. The main battery gun turrets have 16-inch thick faces, mounted atop barbettes that were protected with the same thickness of steel, actually. Her conning tower had 14.7-inch thick sides, and her armor layout was designed to deal with opponents that were using 14-inch guns. And while it was known that Japan in particular was building ships with larger guns, the design couldn't be altered to actually increase the armor. So that was a bit of a weakness, but it never really came into play at any point. North Carolina's keel was laid down at the New York Naval Shipyard on October 27, 1937. She was launched June 13, 1940, and commissioned on April 9, 1941. The ceremony was attended by the Governor of North Carolina, J. Melville Broughton. Her first commanding officer was Captain Olaf M. Hustved, and her shakedown cruise took her into the Caribbean, and she spent the rest of the year working up till the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. With the United States now directly at war, North Carolina was desperately needed, but she was ready to go. As soon as Pearl Harbor happened, she began extensive battle training to prepare for combat in the Pacific. But her first operation wasn't in the Pacific at all. It was in April of 1942, when she was deployed to Naval Station Argentia. She was part of a force intended to block a potential sortie by the German battleship Tirpitz. But Tirpitz was content to stay in her fjord and not really do much of anything. So North Carolina's place was taken by her cousin, South Dakota, so she could head over to the Pacific in the middle of 1942. She passed through the Panama Canal in June, alongside the aircraft carriers Wasp and Long Island, as well as 9 destroyers. On June 15th, she was assigned to Task Force 18, centered around Wasp, under the command of Rear Admiral Leigh Noyes. North Carolina was sent to join the Guadalcanal campaign as part of Task Force 16, which included aircraft carrier Enterprise. The unit was actually a part of Task Force 61, under the command of Vice Admiral Frank Fletcher, and they were supposed to cover the landing of the 1st Marine Division on Guadalcanal, who were to seize the airfield being constructed there by the Japanese. North Carolina covered Enterprise on the first day of the invasion, on August 7th, and stayed with her to keep her safe from Japanese air attacks. There was a serious concern of land-based torpedo bombers, however, so Vice Admiral Fletcher withdrew the carrier groups the following day. The initial landing did meet with little resistance, but a Japanese cruiser squadron attacked the fleet on the night of August 9th, which resulted in a major defeat on Allied naval forces in the Battle of Savo Island. The Navy did consider forming a surface combat force to counter the cruisers, and it would have been centered on North Carolina, but it was decided instead that the need to protect the carrier task forces was way too great to strip away their heavy units, so North Carolina remained on active support duty with the carriers. She would participate in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on the 24th and 25th of August. At the time, American forces had detected a group of Japanese carriers and launched attacks from Saratoga that sank the light carrier Ryujo. But the Japanese would swiftly counterattack, and North Carolina was actually the first to detect it, shortly after 1600 hours. The Japanese initially concentrated on firing at Enterprise, so North Carolina contributed her anti-aircraft fire to protect her charge. Enterprise would increase speed to 30 knots, which caused North Carolina to drop back to 4,000 yards astern. While she was in this position, a group of 7 Aichi D-3A dive bombers attacked North Carolina at 1643, but every single one of them actually missed. North Carolina didn't take any major damage during the battle, though a single member of her crew was killed by a strafing aircraft. Enterprise herself was hit by 3 bombs, but she was able to stay afloat. Enterprise had to withdraw for repairs, so in the meantime, North Carolina was transferred to Task Force 17 to cover Saratoga instead. They operated off of Guadalcanal for the next several weeks, during which time Japanese submarines fired torpedoes at North Carolina twice. The first passed about 300 yards off her port side. The second, however, which happened on September 15th from the submarine I-19, actually hit her. I-19 fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at Wasp in Task Force 18. 2 or 3 of those hit. 2 of the other torpedoes continued on to the ships of Task Force 17, which was 5 nautical miles away. 1 hit a destroyer, O'Brien, and the 4th hit North Carolina. The torpedo hit North Carolina 20 feet below the waterline on her port side, and tore a 32 by 18 foot hole in her plating. 5 men were killed, but besides the shock from the blast disabling her forward turret, the torpedo didn't really damage North Carolina that badly. Flooding did occur, causing her to develop a 5.5 degrees list to port, but that was simply corrected with counterflooding, and she remained on station with Saratoga. I-19's lucky hits would not take North Carolina, though it did take the other 2. Wasp had to be scuttled that evening due to the damage to her, and O'Brien foundered a month later, which I know sounds weird, but it was because she hadn't been repaired from the damage and her hull eventually buckled under the strain. But once North Carolina withdrew, she was detached to Pearl Harbor to get the repairs she did need, and that lasted from September 30th to November 17th. She returned to the South Pacific and began screening again for Saratoga and Enterprise, and the fleet had been strengthened by the arrival of North Carolina's sister Washington, who served as flagship for Rear Admiral Willis Lee. The siblings were grouped together as Task Force 64 under Lee's command, and they covered convoys carrying soldiers and supplies to the Solomon Islands for the rest of 1942 and into 43. In March, North Carolina would go back to Pearl Harbor for a refit that included new radars and improved fire control equipment. When she returned to the South Pacific, she joined up with Task Force 36 that was now under the command of Rear Admiral Glenn B. Davis, and consisted of her cousins Indiana and Massachusetts. Together they covered amphibious assault forces during Operation Cartwheel, which was the campaign to isolate the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, which happened in late June and early July. They didn't see any action during the campaign, however, and in September she made another trip to Pearl Harbor to make preparations for the attack on the Gilbert Islands. With the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, the fleet was organized into Task Force 50, which was divided into several task groups. North Carolina sortied on November 10th, once again alongside Enterprise, as part of Task Group 50.2, and they were to begin with assaults on Macon, Tarawa, and Abamama. North Carolina covered the carriers while they raided the islands, beginning on November 19th. On December 8th, she was detached to form Task Group 50.8, alongside Massachusetts, Indiana, South Dakota, and her sister Washington, under Lee's command. They would commence bombarding the island of Nauru, while the fleet prepared for the next operation in the campaign over in the Marshalls. She then escorted the carrier Bunker Hill during a series of strikes on Kavieng on the island of New Ireland in late December. On the 6th of January in 1944, Task Force 58, which was a fast carrier task force, was created under the command of Rear Admiral Mark Mitchell, and North Carolina continued her role as an escort for the fleet's carriers, with the unit as part of Task Group 58.2. During the Battle of Kwajalein, she initially remained with the carriers during the pre-invasion bombardment, but then she was detached to close with the island and joined the bombardment group targeting Roy Namor. During the attack, she actually sank a cargo ship in the harbor. As the islands were finally secured over 4 days, Task Force 58 departed to raid Truk, which had been Japan's primary staging area in the Central Pacific. By that point, she had been transferred to Task Group 58.3. Known as Operation Hailstone, the attack inflicted serious damage, sinking or destroying 39 ships, wrecking 211 aircraft and damaging another 104 planes. With the Marshalls and Gilbert secured, the Fast Carrier Task Force embarked on a series of raids in the Central Pacific to prepare for the upcoming attack on the Marianas. They sortied from Majuro in late March to begin the first attack on Palayu and Woliai. During those operations, North Carolina managed to shoot down a single Japanese aircraft. Just the one. But she got it, though. Got it! The fleet then sailed south to support the U.S. Army's landing at Hollandia during the New Guinea campaign from the 13th to the 24th of April. Another attack on Truk would follow on the 29th and the 30th. North Carolina shot down another Japanese aircraft during that attack. Yes! Another one! Mark that down! I got 2! And 2 of her Kingfisher float planes were sent to rescue a downed pilot who had crashed off the reef. One of the planes capsized on landing, and the second was unable to take off, so this was really a mess, what I'm trying to say. So a submarine named Tang picked up the men instead. On May 1st, North Carolina and 6 other battleships organized as Task Group 58.7 and bombarded Pohnpei, destroying Japanese artillery batteries, anti-aircraft guns, as well as damaging the airfield on the island. Task Force 58 then returned to its bases in Majuro and Etowetok on May 4th, and from there, North Carolina departed to Pearl Harbor for repairs. She would later rejoin the fleet at Majuro when it was preparing for the attack on the Marianas. She returned to Task Group 58.7, which was distributed between the 4 carrier task groups. She and the rest of 58 sortied on June 6 to launch the first assault, targeting the island of Saipan. On top of protecting the carriers, she also bombarded the island to cover the minesweepers as they cleared paths to the invasion beach. She shelled Tanapag Harbor, sank several small vessels, and destroyed several supply dumps. On June 15th, the Marines went ashore, and a Japanese counterattack struck the fleet, though all but 2 of the aircraft were shot down by the carrier's combat air patrol. Of those 2, North Carolina herself got 1. The landing itself was a breach of Japan's inner defensive perimeter, and that triggered them to launch a major counterthrust with the 1st Mobile Fleet. As they approached, North Carolina and the rest of Task Force 58 steamed to meet it on June 18th, which led to the Battle of the Philippine Sea on the 19th and 20th of June. North Carolina, the other battleships, with 4 cruisers and 13 destroyers, were deployed around 15 nautical miles west of the carrier groups to screen the likely path of approach. The Japanese launched their aircraft first and probed the American fleet's defenses. North Carolina and her sister Washington were the first to open fire, and during the action, which was fought primarily by the carriers, the U.S. fleet inflicted serious losses on the Japanese, They destroyed hundreds of their aircraft and sank 3 of their carriers. North Carolina herself shot down 2 Japanese planes, and she would remain stationed off the Marianas for the next 2 weeks before being detached for an overhaul at Puget Sound. Work on her lasted through October, and that kept her from participating in much of the Philippines campaign. She would rejoin the fleet at their new forward base at Ulithi on November 7th. She joined up with Task Group 38.3, which is the fast carrier task force having passed from 5th Fleet to 3rd Fleet Command. The carriers would then embark on a series of strikes on Japanese positions on Leyte, Luzon, and the Visayas to support army operations on shore. During that time, North Carolina would shoot down a kamikaze aircraft. Such attacks would continue into mid-December, and intensified during the invasion of Mindoro on December 15th. North Carolina was also with the fleet when it was caught by Typhoon Cobra, but she was not seriously damaged, able to weather the severe storm. Once they returned to Ulithi, the fast carrier task force operated a series of strikes on targets on Formosa, the coast of French Indochina, occupied China, and the Ryukyu Islands, in January of 1945. She remained in Task Group 38.3 for that operation, and her carrier group struck northern Formosa on the 3rd and 4th of January, though poor weather hampered flight operations. Further attacks would strike targets on Luzon to destroy reserves of kamikaze aircraft there. On January 10th, the carrier groups entered the South China Sea to strike targets in French Indochina on the assumption that significant Japanese naval forces were present, but this turned out to be untrue. There were only merchant ships and some minor warships, which were still sunk, but not what we expected. During those raids, other elements of the Allied fleet invaded Lingayen Gulf on Luzon. In February, North Carolina escorted carriers during the attacks on the Japanese island of Honshu to disrupt enemy forces that might interfere with the planned invasion of Iwo Jima. By this point, the 5th Fleet had reassumed command of the Fast Carrier Task Force, and North Carolina was now part of Task Group 58.4. They sortied from Ulithi on February 10th, and conducted a series of training exercises off Tinian on the 12th, refueling at sea on the 14th, and continued north to launch strikes on the Tokyo area 2 days later. The raids continued through February 17th, and the following day they withdrew to refuel, and then were sent to hit other islands in the Bonin chain to isolate Iwo Jima. During the preparatory bombardment for that attack, North Carolina, her sister Washington, as well as the heavy cruiser Indianapolis, were detached from the task group to reinforce Task Force 54, which was the assault force for the invasion. She remained on station during their assault and provided fire support as they fought their way across the island. The following day, the carrier groups reassembled and refueled for further operations against the Japanese mainland. When she left Iwo Jima, the fleet resumed air attacks on the home islands to prepare for the next amphibious assault on Okinawa. The first of these, in late February, hit targets in the Tokyo area, followed by another attack on Iwo Jima the next day. They then refueled, and on March 1st raided Okinawa, then returned to Ulithi on March 4th. While in Ulithi, the fleet was reorganized, and North Carolina was transferred to Task Group 58.3. They then sortied on March 14th for additional attacks on Japan, and later hit targets on Kyushu, causing significant damage to Japanese facilities on the island, as well as sinking or damaging numerous warships. The task groups withdrew to refuel and reorganize on March 22nd, however. Several of the carriers had been damaged by kamikaze air attacks, and North Carolina was assigned to the group of ships tasked with escorting them back to Ulithi for repairs. The carrier raids on the home islands and the Ryukyus continued after the landing on Okinawa on April 1st. North Carolina returned to the fleet, and she was assigned to Task Group 58.2. 5 days later, she shot down 3 kamikazes. In the somewhat chaotic anti-aircraft barrage, another ship accidentally hit North Carolina with a 5-inch shell. This killed 3 and wounded 44. On April 7th, the Japanese launched a major air-naval counterattack on the landing centered on the battleship Yamato, but she was taken down by carrier aircraft. North Carolina only shot down a single Japanese bomber. But another major kamikaze attack struck the fleet on April 11th. She would shoot down 2 more on April 17th. And 2 days later she was sent to support infantry attacks on Okinawa, before heading back for another overhaul at Pearl Harbor. She would rejoin the fleet at Leyte Gulf in late June, before embarking on another series of attacks on Japan on July 1st. By that point, the Fast Carrier Task Force had been transferred to the 3rd Fleet again, so she was with Task Group 38.3. The air attacks would begin on July 10th, with over 1,000 aircraft hitting airfields around Tokyo. The strikes would last for more than a week, until another typhoon approached and forced them to withdraw to avoid it on July 19th. During this time, one of North Carolina's Kingfishers picked up a downed pilot in Tokyo Bay under heavy fire. And following the Japanese surrender on August 15th, North Carolina would contribute men with the initial occupation force and entered Sagami Bay on August 27th with the rest of the fleet. She thereafter patrolled the coast until September 5th, when she headed into Tokyo Bay to re-embark the men. The following day, she was assigned to Task Force 11, along with the New Mexico-class battleships, which was to return to the United States. She would then sail south to Okinawa to take on men bound for home as part of Operation Magic Carpet. During her wartime service, only 10 of her crew would die, 67 would be wounded, and she would receive 15 battle stars, the most of any battleship in the U.S. fleet during World War II. She transited the Panama Canal on October 8th and arrived in Boston on October 17th. She then underwent an overhaul in the Brooklyn Navy Yard and conducted training operations off the East Coast. She was actually the only American treaty battleship to see any significant service after the end of the war. The vast majority would be immediately removed from service, but not North Carolina. She stayed around for at least a couple years, though she was eventually decommissioned on June 27, 1947, in New York and placed in reserve. While she was sitting out of service, the Navy did look into several plans to possibly modernize or convert her to other uses. A series of studies in 1954 focused on the concept of improving her speed to 31 knots, which would require a significant reduction in displacement and a much more powerful propulsion system. The displacement issue could actually be solved with the removal of her rear turret, but there just wasn't enough room in her hull to place a power plant that could push her to the desired speed. The Navy also looked into possibly converting her into a helicopter carrier, which would have involved removing all her main and secondary guns, except for her forward turret, which would be retained just to keep her balanced properly. These would be exchanged for a flight deck and facilities for 28 helicopters and a battery of 16 3-inch guns. But then the Navy figured that a new purpose-built helicopter carrier would actually be cheaper in the long run and wind up with a better result, so they abandoned the project. She did remain in the Navy's inventory until she was stricken from the Naval Vessel Register on June 1st, 1960, and she was slated to be broken up for scrap, just as her sister was. In her case, there was an intervention. A resident of North Carolina, James Craig, founded a campaign to save her. He actually modeled it on the battleship Texas Commission that had saved USS Texas, the last dreadnought. Craig would manage to convince then-governor of North Carolina, Luther H. Hodges, to ask the Navy to delay scrapping of North Carolina. Craig then went on to raise $250,000 to prepare a site to host the vessel and to tow her there, as well as fund work to prepare her for visitors, as she was supposed to be a museum ship. He managed to attain the help of WRAL, a TV station, which broadcast a Save Our Ship advertisement campaign. He also ran ads in numerous state newspapers to spread the word across North Carolina about the movement to save their battleship. Craig was able to secure more than $330,000 for the project, and eventually he settled on a site in Wilmington, which was further inland and therefore more protected from hurricanes. The governor had been successful in delaying the Navy, and on September 6, 1961, North Carolina was given to, well, North Carolina. she was given to her estate. She was towed out of New Jersey bound for Wilmington by a group of 9 tugboats on September 25th of that year. Though moving her was not without incident. On October 2nd, the tugs lost control of North Carolina. "You don't have enough tugs to control me!" And she wound up colliding with a floating seafood restaurant, but somehow only caused minor damage. When her berth was completed, located across the Cape Fear River from downtown Wilmington, about 28 miles from the river's confluence with the Atlantic Ocean, she was formally opened on April 29, 1962 as a memorial to more than 11,000 North Carolinians who died while serving during World War II. It was a beautiful success in terms of historic preservation, and North Carolina's life since being turned into a museum ship hasn't been completely uneventful. In 1964, a Kingfisher floatplane that had crashed in British Columbia, Canada during the war was donated to the museum since, well, she used to carry those for one, and for two it had been salvaged. In the early 80s, when the Navy reactivated the Iowa class, parts were cannibalized from North Carolina to help restore the Iowas to service. Engine room components that were no longer available in the Navy's inventory accounted for most of the material taken. She was, however, declared a National Historic Landmark on November 10, 1982, with the application noting that she was in excellent condition and remained in her wartime configuration. Work to maintain her is an ongoing effort, as I have mentioned many times. When it comes to preserving a ship, it is a never-ending fight. Ships, especially because they're in water, rust very quickly and need intensive maintenance just all the time to keep them afloat. And the larger the ship is, the more expensive that is. So give some props to any floating museum you find. They have to work overtime to make this happen. In relation to that, in 1998, her operators ran Operation Shipshape, which was a donation drive to secure funds to make repairs to North Carolina, including her teak deck. Funds were also allocated to repair her hull, which by the early 2000s had deteriorated significantly, because of course it did. That always, literally always happens. In some places, corrosion had reduced the thickness of the hull to as thin as only 0.15 inches, which is horrifying, actually. They considered moving her to a dry dock for the work, but that would have been way too expensive for them at the time. So the caretakers decided to use the same method that had been utilized to refurbish Alabama. They erected a cofferdam around North Carolina's hull and pumped it dry. Basically, it was a makeshift dry dock. They wound up replacing her damaged hull plates and repainted it to better protect it from the elements. In 2018, a walkway was erected around North Carolina to allow visitors to view her from all sides. Repairs to her hull were completed in 2021. At the beginning of just this year, 2024, the memorial and museum is one of North Carolina's most visited tourist sites. In 2022, the museum had nearly 250,000 visitors, and that was the most financially successful year in their history. It would certainly seem that North Carolina is in very good hands, and the showboat of the U.S. Navy will remain with us for many years to come.